Hi, welcome to another episode of China 411. This is Huang Zhenyu along with my co-host Ken Wilcox, and today we're going to talk about banking and finance. Ken, how are you doing?
So today we have with us Dave Jones, who runs Silicon Valley Bank's joint venture in Shanghai. Before that, he was chief credit officer at Silicon Valley Bank worldwide for about 20 years. So what do you think we can get out of Dave today?
Well, I'm just very fascinated because Dave came from Oklahoma, if I remember. And he's now have spent 3 years in China and will probably spend 7 more. Just love to understand
Probably
that.
the rest of his life. My guess, yeah.
Yeah. I just love to understand that American journey in China and then starting up and continuing to grow this tremendous joint venture in the banking sector, in a heavily regulated sector. That's fascinating.
So Dave, where do you want to start? Tell us about how you got to China.
So first, let me say that if I'm in China another 3 or 7 years, I hope that's not the rest of my life. I hope that there's a life after China for me. I think that it is fair to say that I am one of the least likeliest persons to ever end up in China. So having grown up in Oklahoma, it was quite an adventure to find my way to California. And I think that a lot of my coworkers here were greatly surprised when it was announced I was moving to China. But I would say to them and everybody that it isn't as different as a lot of people would think. There are a lot of things in common between the United States and China, much more so than most Americans believe, and much more so than most Chinese believe, I think, anyway.
Well, that's an interesting place to start. Why don't you expand on that for a minute?
Well, so a part of it is that we were raised on each sides of the Pacific with certain perceptions of the other country, right? So as Americans, Ken, we were raised with media content about China. And as I have talked with colleagues and other people over these few years that I've been in China, then I have a sense that in China it was much the same. There was a popular opinion about America. And I think that for most Americans, we grew up believing that the Chinese were very different. And I think that for most of the Chinese, they grew up thinking that Americans were very different. And as we have been growing our staff and our client base in China, I find that there are a lot of similarities, and maybe it is mostly because we deal with innovation companies. So an innovation company in the United States is very similar to an innovation company in China, and vice versa. Okay, some of the issues are the same, even the language, right? The programming language is the same that is being coded in China or is being coded in the U.S. Now, there are some differences. There's some distinct cultural differences. One of the things that we've been working with in recent weeks is the idea of localizing our web page. So the American image, the Western image of what a web page should look like is very clean, maybe I would say very uncluttered. But in China, it is full of content, absolutely full. I mean, there really isn't a square centimeter on a page, a web page in China that doesn't seem to be occupied. There are the cultural differences, and for an American, for a 50% American bank, then we clearly have to figure out how to localize on those things that are in fact different.
What is it you're trying to accomplish in China, or what is it that Silicon Valley Bank is trying to accomplish in China?
So I think, simply put, Silicon Valley Bank is supporting innovation, as we do here, as we do in Europe, as we do in Canada. Okay, supporting innovation. Silicon Valley Bank, for these more than 30 years, has developed an ability to bank innovation companies in a deeper, a richer, an earlier stage than any other bank. And we find that the innovation companies in China need the same thing. They need a bank that will be there earlier, that will be richer and deeper, more supportive of them and the entire innovation ecosystem. So that is our mission.
So it's the same worldwide, basically.
Same worldwide.
Tell us about the banking sectors. How are they different or similar?
The banking sector?
Yeah.
So there are definitely some differences. If you were to look at the banking sector in China versus the banking sector in the United States. One difference is the number of offices. I think I could putt a golf ball from one ICBC office to the next one, and I could make my way all the way across Shanghai. So there are so many offices, so close together.
More than Starbucks here.
More than Starbucks here, and more even than Starbucks in China, which is very similar to Starbucks here. And in a sense, Ken, that reminds me of American banking 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it will be interesting to see how that landscape changes in China over the next 10 years. Nothing in China takes as long as it does here. So if I think about the changes in the number of banking offices in the United States 20 years ago to today, took us 20 years to get here. In China, 10 years probably.
So
everything happens quicker there.
You're alluding to the move towards internet banking? Is that what your speaks?
Internet banking will be part of it, for sure. But the fact that the number of physical branches becomes less and less important. I think as we move into an ever-changing, more modern, more digital banking environment, the need for offices decreases. So Silicon Valley Bank in China. Today in Shanghai, we have one office. We are in the process of opening a branch in Beijing. We just finished construction on that 2 weeks ago. We'll go through the regulatory approvals, maybe be officially endorsed to open in a January, February timeframe. But in Beijing, we'll have one office. And then next year, I intend to start working on a Shenzhen office.
Now you speak of regulation.
Yes.
Can you talk about the difference in regulation and regulators between the two countries? And I know, Ken, you have some real life experiences there as well.
Yeah. So maybe because of Ken having preceded me, my view may be a little bit different because he changed things before I arrived. But in a lot of ways, the regulation's the same. If you think about some important factors like bank secrecy, anti-money laundering, there are a lot of similarities between what we would experience here in the United States and what we would experience in China. I would say at least 85% overlap. There are some differences. So we don't have deposit interest rate controls in the United States
Anymore.
China still very much has deposit interest rate controls, and we have to try to figure out how to operate our business, supporting our clients and remaining compliant at the same time. Another thing I would say about regulation between the United States and China, it is odd, it's very infrequent for there to be changes in law here. In China, it's much more frequent. And we have benefited from 2 or 3 changes in law just in the last 3 or 4 years. So it is a marketplace that is still evolving and willing to change on a regulatory level.
And the regulators you have encountered, do you see any differences or similarities?
You know, if I could close my eyes and if everything was in English,
Yeah.
very much the same.
Wow.
I find that the people that we're working with, and our primary regulator would be the CBRC in Shanghai, but for our Beijing branch, that has to be approved by the Beijing CBRC. But I find the people to be very similar. So that's a positive thing in my mind.
I would agree with that. I think the CBRC and the Federal Reserve, the kinds of people that are attracted to working there, the way they comport themselves on the job, very, very similar. But I have a different view of some of the other things that you said. Of course, it's a little bit hard to tease apart in China regulator and government. Whereas in the U.S., the regulators are somebody that we deal with all the time. The government we deal with very seldom.
Right.
And because it's a little hard to tell what's the regulator and what's the government in China, I'm going to lump them together and say that in a lot of ways they have a lot more to say in China than they do in the U.S. So for example, I think we call ourselves the Bank for Innovation. Is that not right?
Right.
In China. That took about a year of arguing before we were allowed to do that.
Okay.
Whereas I think if in the U.S. you were to say to the Federal Reserve, our new bank is going to be called whatever, the First National Bank of Pittsburgh, the bank for the coal industry, they wouldn't care. I can't imagine that they would object to that. But in China, I had to talk with the CBRC about that over and over again. And finally, they just seemed to kind of just wear them down. They finally said, okay, we can do it. I do think that the government has more influence. But again, it's hard to say whether, if you're just talking about regulators strictly, it may not be that much different.
Yes, and I was thinking about the day-to-day interaction with just the regulator, not the government part. And I certainly see that on the government side.
No, it's very interesting you use the word partner. And SVB in China is in a joint venture, which is quite of a throwback to a time past. because when China first opened up, every foreign company had to have a joint venture. And over time, foreign companies decided to have their own wholly owned subsidiaries. How is it working in a joint venture, especially in a heavily regulated, state-dominated industry such as banking?
So, our experience, so Ken's tenure in China and my tenure in China are different, clearly. Things that Ken had to deal with the opening would be different than what I have to deal with, which I might distinguish. Ken opened it, I run it, and there's a difference there.
Yep.
So with Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, I can't imagine having had a better partner. So you think about what you want with a partner. You want somebody that complements you. Silicon Valley Bank brings the knowledge, the experience, the perspective of working with the innovation company. And Shanghai Pudong Development Bank acknowledges that it doesn't have that, so it stays out of that. What I've experienced these last 3 years is that anytime and every time we needed help, they were there to help us. But when we weren't asking for help, they weren't there, right? Which is a positive, not a negative, in that if somebody is involved and trying to help make decisions in areas that they're not familiar with, then it can be obstructive. With SPDB and Mr. Leo, in particular, now president of SPDB, a great business person, a great gentleman, and a great partner. But I would say that our joint venture contractually is with SPDB. We need to appreciate, as Ken was talking about, this government versus CBRC, that our real joint venture partner isn't SPDB, it's the state of China. My view, I expressed this to the SVB board last year when they were asking about joint ventures and the historical experience with joint ventures, which isn't altogether positive. I reminded them that China, the government, is our real joint venture partner. If China is happy with us, SPDB can never be unhappy with us.
So, what are some of the other challenges that you face being a banker in China, and particularly in the innovation space? How is it more challenging than you might have anticipated in some regards?
Yeah. We have the great benefit of SVB's legacy. On a global scale, SVB is a small bank, right? So it's a small big bank or a big small bank, however you might want to think about it. But our reputation is far bigger than our physical size. So it's amazing, isn't it, Ken, that everywhere you go in China, the people know us. I mean, I don't know, if we were JP Morgan, I don't know that it would be any more recognizable name than Silicon Valley Bank.
I'm guessing if you did one of those press counts where you have computers, it used to be an army of people, now a computer going through all of the newspapers and checking for the frequency of names. I would not be at all surprised if Silicon Valley Bank's name occurs more frequently than that of any bank in the world.
Outside of China.
Outside of China,
Yep.
in China.
Right.
In China.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, any non-Chinese bank in China.
Yep. So we have a great reputation, and that opens the door. But my sense of it is it doesn't necessarily translate into the same trust that we have here. So SVB's reputation in the United States, I think, may carry to 50% of the sales process. There's still very much a process required here. But in China, if it's 50% here, we still have 80% to do, maybe 90% to do in China. In this spirit of localization, it's good for us to be able to tell local VCs, local entrepreneurs about what we've done in the United States. But it's going to be so much more beneficial when we have a greater legacy of opportunities with the local teams. That is a slow process, but one that we're progressing on. Going back to interest rates, one of the things, and I've only worked at Silicon Valley Bank for the last 20 years, so I can't say what it would be like working anywhere else. But in the United States, I don't think that the conversations for both deposits and loans is quite so intense around deposits, a deposit rate. In China, we have great conversations with great people about them opening a deposit relationship and starting a lending relationship. But the first question they really want us to answer is, what is your rate? I think that's a part of our youth and a part of our becoming more local. When we have more local history, then one person will have heard it from another person, and that will be more beneficial for us. But we're, as a bank, we're technically 4 years old, but I might say in a practical manner, we're only 1 year old. So in China banking rules, a foreign bank, and we're 50-50 owned by SVB and SPDB, that 50% by SVB makes us a foreign bank in China. One of the things that we're dealing with is being considered a foreign bank instead of a local bank.
So, what's the difference between a foreign bank and a local bank in China?
I think part of it is that they don't know how long we're going to be there. So they're like any foreign bank going into any market. Foreign banks come to the United States banks going abroad. They don't always go and stay there.
Well, as a foreign bank, do you feel like you get preferential treatment, either positive or negative?
So that's a good question, and my sense is negative, more negative than positive. There are rules that cannot be broken, and there are rules that can be broken. And I think that a local bank has a higher probability of being able to stretch, if not break, the rules than we as a foreign bank would have. Would you agree, Ken?
Definitely. Not only would I agree, but the Chinese bankers that I've talked to about this topic have said that themselves. They have said, there are a lot of rules. We know which ones we can break, but you better obey every one of them because you're probably not going to get a lot of slack.
Right.
Oh.
So going back to the earlier conversation about government and the CBRC, maybe government and the PBOC, it could be that where the government influence is that even the local banks best not violate it, right? So paying a higher rate of interest may be something that the local banks can't violate any more than the foreign banks.
Yeah. And so what about going back to that tension that so many people here have talked about? There's a tension between an American partner with the knowledge and expertise and a local partner with the openness and willingness to learn. And over time, how does that work? Especially as the local partner becomes more and more adept.
Yeah. Well, the clear reality is that we compete with SPDB. We may have negotiated in our original articles of incorporation that we wouldn't compete. But let's not kid ourselves. We are competing. We have frequent conversations around how we partner with different groups, more so SPDB than others, but still different groups. How do we partner with them without teaching them to do what we do?
What do you think our joint venture partner wants out of the relationship? What is their goal? What's their end game? And what is Silicon Valley Bank's goal and end game?
Yeah.
Because I suspect this is one of those cases that people often refer to as one bed, two dreams.
Dream of the red chamber.
Yeah, I don't want to even imagine that. So I think for SPDB, what they want to be able to do is on a high level, they want to be able to tell the government all that they are doing to support innovation. Okay? They want to be able to say it for themselves directly, and then they could always say it for their 50% ownership in our joint venture bank, right? They could take all that credit, and they should. And then I would say also that there are some professional bankers that want to grow their business and see innovation as a good area maybe to grow their business. So government and then the business side of it is what our partner wants. What we want is we want to be able to help the very best innovation companies. And I might define the very best innovation companies as those that can get venture capital funding. We want to be able to support the venture capitalists. We want to be able to support the innovation companies. We want to be able to bank the next generation of Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent.
So given those two different, although not contradictory necessarily, but different goals, to what extent do you think that they're in conflict, and to what extent are they in harmony with each other?
Yeah. So there's room for great conflict if that's the way we want it, and there's also room for great cooperation if that's the way we want it. And my preference would be in the direction of the cooperation. Okay, to find the things that we can do to support these different interests, government and business interest, short of teaching them exactly how to do our business so that we're no longer necessary.
Now, you mentioned ICBC in the beginning, right? An ICBC at every corner.
Right.
And they have now opened a few branches here in the U.S. What's the prospect of these Chinese banks moving overseas, especially to a place like the United States?
Well, so the likelihood of them being successful here?
Yes.
Yeah. I have great empathy for them because I think that is for them exactly what I'm experiencing, what we are experiencing in China. So I have to answer by saying they can be successful because I have to believe we're going to be successful, and if we could be successful, they can be. But they're going to have to do here what we have to do there, which is to localize, right? So I was speaking in an event last Friday, and afterwards was talking to a reporter, and his question of me was, could a Facebook, could a Google be successful in China? Well, Google's been there before. Facebook isn't there today. My answer to him is yes, of course, but they're going to have to localize, right? So Facebook isn't going to look like Facebook that we're familiar with here. It's going to probably need to look a lot more like WeChat. Okay, that's what the mindset in China is, and for ICBC to open and be successful here, they're going to have to be more local, unless they're simply going to target the Chinese company in its business here. They're going to have to localize to be successful.
But it can be done. Look at Union Bank. Who owns Union Bank?
Mitsubishi, I guess, or
Yeah, it's Japanese owned, and I don't think.
Or you have Deutsche Bank. You have quite a few.
I don't think very many people think about Union Bank as being Japanese owned. You and I might because we're banking professionals, but average person on the street doesn't know the difference. And plenty of people bank at Union Bank.
But Ken, isn't that proof?
It's
of
proof.
localization.
Yeah. It's proof exactly.
Now,
There's no regulatory obstacle to ICBC being successful in China.
Right.
It's only a localization issue.
Right.
yeah. But now you talked about the advantage that SVB has in China, which is that knowledge of innovation, right? Innovation banking. What's the strength of these Chinese banks? Not just in China, but elsewhere. Like, what can they bring to the table that others cannot? What makes them potentially uniquely, fiercely globally competitive?
So size can be
Size.
important. I guess ICBC is probably the largest bank in the world, and so that could be a benefit for them. One of the things that tomorrow, I think, October 1st, the RMB becomes part of the, is it called SDR?
Oh, the mixed basket
Right.
of currencies.
So more and more, I think that we're going to see trade in RMB, and clearly ICBC on a global basis is going to have a huge head start in being able to do all things RMB. So also I will say this, that China obviously is the second largest economy in the world, and I think it is likely, for as long as I can imagine, to remain at least the second largest economy in the world. China companies, China itself has a great appetite for buying businesses outside the country. ICBC could play an important role in helping Chinese businesses do their business outside of the border of China.
I'd like to add one thing to that, though, because I think ICBC has another very significant advantage that you haven't mentioned yet, and that is in the history of modern China, there has never been a bank that has failed. And in the U.S., banks fail every year, and sometimes big ones. Admittedly, our government does often step in and help, but often it doesn't. Witness Lehman Brothers.
Right.
And unless the Chinese government changes its approach to supporting banks, I think that ICBC, like every other bank in China, will continue to enjoy government support in the event that it runs into trouble. We should bring this to a happy conclusion, though, because we are running out of time. Thank you very much for coming.
Happy to. Thank you.
Very much appreciated. A good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you again, and this wraps up another episode of China 411. See you in the future.